some of the participants in our Transatlantic and European Dialogue on China, an initiative of the Penn Project, which builds on the same principles that the Penn Project is founded on, of elevating next generation leading scholars and expert perspectives in policy discussions, but with a focus on European experts from throughout the continent and also the UK. This is an initiative that we have been developing over the past 4 years, including with in-person meetings over the years in Rome, in Leiden, in Paris, in Brussels, and most recently, we were able to convene 20 of the participants in this program in Washington, D.C. for a full week of dialogues with a really wide range of U.S. policymakers and other policy relevant actors. It was an incredibly instructive week of discussions that were really focused on policy towards China and what are the prospects for transatlantic coordination in addressing the various challenges posed by China's rise. But it took place at a time of special ferment in transatlantic relations generally. Of course, we are all reading the news and seeing headlines about Greenland and other aspects of transatlantic relations that have been fraught in recent weeks. And we were there with this extraordinary group of experts on China from throughout Europe at that very momentous time. So what you'll hear today is some takeaways from the trip from a few of the participants, all of whom are remarkable, but are representing a much wider group of really remarkable people who are, in many cases, the leading expert on China in their respective countries. Hearing from them about what they took away from the week in DC, including, of course, on possibilities of coordination or prospects for differences with respect to policy on China. But then again, perhaps we'll also hear some reflections on transatlantic relations generally, because it's hard to avoid that topic at the present time. Without further ado, let me invite our panelists today to come up on screen so I can introduce them to you, and then we will get going with the conversation. So here with me, you see, in no particular order, Miguel Otero from Spain, from the Royal Elcano Institute. Tim Rühlig, coming to us, I think from Brussels, probably, where he is with the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Sam Geall, coming to us, I believe, from London, where he is with Chatham House. Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova from Latvia, where she's a professor at Riga Stradins University and also with the Latvian Institute for International Affairs. And Nadine Godehardt, also, I believe, coming to us from Brussels, where she is with the German Institute for International Security Affairs, also known as SWP. It is so nice to see all of you online in this setting. It was a very packed week, and we're all still processing everything that we learned in mostly closed-door settings, and we'll have to respect the Chatham House nature of the conversations. But we can, I think, share with this Zoom audience and more broadly on YouTube later some of the general takeaways that you all took away from the week in DC. Let me get our conversation going, and I think I'm going to ask Nadine to go first. So Nadine, let me ask you to share some of your key takeaways from the week of discussions in DC that, at least nominally, were supposed to be focused on prospects of coordination or issues of difference when it comes to policy towards China.
Yeah, thank you, Neysun. Also, thank you for having me here in this discussion round. I think I have a couple of general takeaways, actually, that I want to point out right now. And I think the first takeaway for me was that there's no particular US interest in multilateralism or multilateral organization and or the global governance system. And this is quite an important change from a European perspective. I mean, there always has been this discussion how much the United States are respecting multilateral organizations, but I think this disbelief in the functionality of multilateral organizations, not only trade, but also regarding the UN system, is quite a change for the European Union and for European member states. And that also has an impact, obviously, on how Europe, the European Union, the member states look at the United States. And I think one of the impacts is that, and this is also something that was quite clear to me in this week, there's no real vision for the world from still, the most powerful country in the world. And that is, I think, quite interesting. There might be a vision for the United States, but I'm not so sure if that is really a vision for the world. And that also means that for me, it was quite unclear how the future of global order, of, international relations in that sense, in this very broad sense, is going to look like when multilateral organizations are less and less important. And this also includes, the EU is a supranational organization, but still one of the main actors in multilateral diplomacy. We just saw this with the EU-China FTA trade. And so this is very important for the European Union. And I think this is going to be, a big dilemma for further coordination in all kinds of policy fields, but also regarding China. And maybe just a very quick second point that I like to make. What was kind of interesting to me is that there has been no critical reflection on why transatlantic coordination towards China has been so difficult, and maybe even from the US perspective, regarded unsuccessful in the past. I mean, we've heard this from some of the US participants, very simplified. The US tried everything under Biden. There have been plenty of debates and discussions, but nothing really worked. The European Union simply not aligned with the US policy. This is probably a little bit too easy, but on the other hand, why should the Trump administration now even bother trying, to coordinate with the European Union? And that is, I think, something that is also rather dangerous. I mean, if, again, a very important player in international relations is not able to self-reflect, also means it's not really able to learn, from what has been probably going wrong, and maybe even mistakes, not only from the European side, but also from the US side in these negotiations. And I think this is something that is really showing again another dilemma of the future of EU transatlantic relations, but in particular when they are coordinating on China. And
Thanks, Nadine. That's I have to admit, from where I sit, that's a bit of a grim perspective, and I wonder if your impression was that this shift that you detected in the U.S. away from multilateralism, did that feel to you from the totality of our conversations as something that was of a shorter term nature or potentially of a longer term nature?
Honestly, on the longer term nature, I mean, it's something that has built up in the past. It's nothing that happened just yesterday, but I think with the second Trump administration, we really see a turning away from the very idea that lays behind multilateral organization. This means, I mean, it's really not about criticizing the work of multilateral organizations, like the work of the WTO or the United Nations. I mean, we heard this criticism quite some time, but it's really about the essence of these institutions. And this is a rather big dilemma for the European Union. That's a very big difference. I mean, our self-understanding in Europe has very much to do with norms and rules that are basically underlying international relations. If that is not the case on the other side of the Atlantic, then obviously there is some kind of contradiction. And so what is the alternative? I think what I'm thinking about when I came back from DC is really, did I hear any kind of alternative, except for maybe, short alliance building and anything that is maybe a network that is built around the United States? And I'm not so sure. Honestly, I'm still thinking about it. But I guess from a European perspective, that is a very hard reality that people and policymakers over here have to deal with right now.
Thank you, Nadine. Let me turn next to Tim and ask Tim also to share sort of his broader takeaways from the visit. And maybe, Tim, if I could invite you not just to build on Nadine's remarks generally, whether you agree or disagree, but also to the extent that Nadine is detecting kind of the shift in the U.S. away from multilateralism, at least when it comes also in particular with respect to China. I think it's fair to say that we encountered a lot of perspectives throughout the week that suggested frustration with the EU and with European countries when it comes to working together with respect to China. And I wonder if you might want to build in something about that point and whether, that is, from your perspective, part of why the U.S. may be moving away from multilateralism, not just generally, but specifically when it comes to China.
Thanks, Neysun. Well, I want to start off by really thanking you and your entire team for hosting us in DC. I think this has been really an incredible week, and I hope that all the viewers live and later, whoever watches this YouTube video gets sort of a little idea of all the really fruitful and rich discussions we have had. And this is really thanks to you and your team. So I need to say that up front. Now to your question, main takeaway, I think, building on Nadine, but I think the first perspective for me is interesting. I think until the second Trump administration, I think we've seen in the US pretty much a consensus, a bipartisan consensus growing on China, that China is substantive, some would even say an existential security threat to the United States. This is something that I think some Europeans to some degree may have agreed to in the past. I don't think you find many Europeans who would agree that it goes as far as to call China an existential threat. So at first you may think, now with Donald Trump, who seems to have a more, at least he himself seems to have more of a transactional perspective on China, trying to recalibrate, maybe also looking a bit more on the economy, that this could potentially actually resonate with parts of Europe better. At the same time, of course, then all that Nadine has just said comes in, that there is very little interest and very little prospect for cooperating in multilateral organizations, but also building on existing partnerships, alliances, traditions, also values. So that makes it very difficult for the EU. So that I think is sort of then making cooperation almost, maybe not impossible, but making it very difficult. Of course, before I get to sort of this specific question that you posed to me, let me also just add one further aspect here. I mean, I think I came back from Beijing not that long before, and interesting, I think both Washington and Beijing don't really take Europeans very seriously at this point for a very simple reason, because we at this point don't really speak the language of power. So we may have some leverage. I think that both Americans and Chinese do depend to Europe at least as a sales market opportunity, but also more. I mean, there is still technology cooperation, there is research cooperation, and so on and so forth. So there is more. There are more benefits, I think, for the US and for China from cooperating with us, but we are not weaponizing that. We are not using it to push for our own interests. So it is a bit of a bitter lesson for a European, I think, to say that maybe we need to learn to speak the language of power again. But that is an interesting sort of symmetry that I think we see with both sides. And interestingly, I think if we were starting to speak that language of power with one side, probably the other would also react and sort of reassess our relationship with the respective other. So that I think is a takeaway. Now the frustration that you said. I mean, I think in principally I can relate to that. I can see sort of how Europe has been slow and indecisive. I mean, we are a difficult actor to deal with. I think this is very hard to deny. Also, as a proud European, I have to admit that. Maybe sometimes it is also a corrective force to have different voices. And that is not necessarily appreciated. We have to acknowledge that. But indeed, I think it is fair to say that we understand that if the Biden administration was already sort of feeling the pain that a Trump administration that is far less transatlantic would find even less appetite to coordinate with us. But I think that is, in the end, a call for Europe to wake up, to coordinate better. I'm not sure it will be the EU 27 at all stages. It may just be EU minus and EU plus. So a group of member states in Europe working with others. We have with Sam with us from the UK. So I think coordination with the UK will play a role. To what extent this will include the US, I mean, I'm sure we'll dive a bit deeper into that over the course of the coming minutes. But yeah, that is sort of, I'm sort of less optimistic than I would have been a couple of months ago, I think.
And just to maybe belabor the point, would you agree that kind of a perspective that sort of seemed a consensus perspective throughout the week from a lot of our American interlocutors was that as much as the Biden administration tried to lean into transatlanticism generally, there was a lot of frustration on the part of many people who were within the administration trying to coordinate with Europe. And that when the Trump administration came in, they were aware of that legacy. And so, it's not to say that all of the Trump administration's approach to multilateralism is rooted in that, but that it did feed into perhaps the way that the Trump administration has been managing its relations with Europe when it comes to China.
Well, I think it's a mix. I think the awareness of how painful it was to work with Europeans, I believe, is widespread. I'm not sure this is the reason for the entire Trump administration not to work with us. It feels this is very much, yeah. I mean, I keep being reminded of Zelensky's visit in the Oval Office, his first one, where Trump sort of said, "You have no cards. You have no cards." So a lot seems to be about the question: does someone have cards or not? And I don't know. I don't know whether everyone in the Trump administration would admit that we have cards in principle, but I think there's a consensus that we are unable or unwilling to using them. Not against the United States, not against China. But if we are not willing or able to use them against China, I think the consensus view probably among many in the Trump administration is, why then let them play with us, if you like, if they're not playing anyways, if we keep waiting. I mean, they want to go forward. And that, I think, is a process in which Europe is certainly in. I think it is fair to say that we are not as quick and decisive in this geopolitical game. At the same time, it is interesting, shortly after our return from Washington, the whole situation around Greenland escalated further. And there was this moment where Europe started to talk about using the so-called anti-coercion instrument, which is certainly sort of the strongest sword we have in relation with the United States. And it was interesting because within a couple of hours, I got a couple of messages from Beijing, some saying, "Oh, so that seems to be the red line. Ultimately, you guys are starting and departing from the US, while many had sort of seen us as surrendering to anything that Trump asked from us." But at the same time, it was coupled with this question, what is the red line that you guys might have with China? And that's what I'm saying, why I said before, maybe getting tough on one of the partners is also sending a signal to the respective other. But Europeans are really still in this process of learning to play their geopolitical cards and to shore up what that implies then for the transatlantic relationship. I think still remains a bit to be seen because on the one hand, we become a credible actor. On the other, I think we are also a bit more of a competitor, someone to being taken seriously. That can be a serious cooperation, but I fear it can also be sort of a more serious competition with the US. That I think still sort of remains to be seen, and there is some truth in the analysis of the Trump administration when it comes to Europe. I wish there would be more transatlantic cooperation. I'm not so sure how optimistic I'm in the end on that.
Thank you, Tim. Let me turn next to Una, including because Tim, you referenced Vladimir Zelensky's visit to the Oval Office, and so much of transatlantic relations generally is now through the prism of the war in Ukraine, which is of special interest to those in the Baltic states. So, Una, again, building on what you've heard so far from Nadine and Tim, and adding your own perspectives, what are your main takeaways from the week in DC?
Yeah, thanks, Neysun. And I echo Tim in thanking you and the project for the opportunity to be there and to come back with these takeaways. In fact, indeed, it was helpful for us. And I would say that one of our colleagues, when we were discussing the takeaways, said everything felt black and white. And I can't help but feel that she's absolutely right. But also because of this black and white approach, some contradictions surfaced that you don't necessarily see when things are more tuned down. And so if we're talking about these contradictions, and us as China scholars, that's where we come from. We look for contradictions in politics. So some of the opposing views that I brought from this trip. First of all, does China matter in US policymaking? Obviously, the immediate knee-jerk response would be yes, sure. It's the main peer, it's the main rival. But we heard both yes, rare earths, these kinds of things, supply chain, and also sort of no, right? Not necessarily as an issue of prime concern. And another thing that this brought is that there is no clear China strategy. And I think that was one of the things that is a takeaway. But the question remains whether that's by design or not. So, and we had different opinions, whether clarity can be found, from practice, look at what we're doing. That's the strategy sort of approach. Like I'm almost tempted to say 实事求是 approach. Whereas the other opinion that we encountered was that perhaps there is none and the explaining is retroactive. So, and of course, the implications in the second case are such that even in the unlikely scenario of tremendous sudden political will on the European side, a shared approach to China would not be possible, because how do you coordinate if there's no approach? Now, the other thing that against this black and white backdrop, I found that I didn't come back with a clear answer on, rather with opposing answers, was what's the European role in the Indo-Pacific going to be? Or rather, what is the envisaged European role of in the Indo-Pacific that the current US administration has? If it is stay out of that hemisphere message for the Europeans, it's very clear that the European powers who have Indo-Pacific interests will not comply with that, right? Because why would they? And that then in turn would lead to yet another security clash or security, escalation between the US and Europe. And we've already had quite a few this year, and it's not even March. So I think we heard a lot about, Europe taking care of its own security first, but that also does not stop at Europe. That does not stop at Europe's geographical borders. And I think that is something that that was missed. And the third was, what is the US's approach to Taiwan? What's it going to be? And obviously, again, we know it's always been famously ambiguous, but the situation seems to have changed. And we have heard about possibly up to four Trump-Xi meetings this year. And we've also heard, and going back to what Tim says about countries and regions having cards versus not having cards, we have also heard that there's been a realization among the current administration that China perhaps has more cards than initially assumed. And so my question is this going to be a game of cards, or is this going to be a negotiation with mutual concessions? And what does that then mean for Taiwan?
That's great, Una. That's a very, very rich set of ideas. And I'm just going to pull on one of those strings, maybe in some ways anticipating a little bit of our later conversation as well. But you've really introduced robustly into the conversation now this theme that I agree was pervasive throughout the week of uncertainty about what exactly is the U.S. posture towards China right now, which had seemed relatively clear in recent years around what we sometimes term the bipartisan consensus on better addressing the challenge, or even in some people's views, the threat posed by China. And I agree, independent of our week, that there's a lot of ferment right now around what exactly are these different signals from the administration connoting. But we also encountered that a lot throughout the week in lots of different discussions. And so the follow-up question that I want to pose to you, Una, is how much does that matter to Europe, that the signal coming from the U.S. about what the U.S. policy towards China seems to be so much more uncertain today than it had been for the last few years through a series of different administrations?
Well, I think it matters on the operational level, but it also matters on the level of behavior, because we've seen that there are attempts at pushing European nations to do what they don't necessarily want to do. And if a part of this perhaps not unclear or ambiguous China strategy is also connected to the same approach, then we're going to get these signals to do something without clearly understanding, where does that leave us? Why is it in our interest? And where does it even fall within the grand scheme of things and the grand vision? So I think it's going to be quite problematic. But I have to echo Tim here that I was also taken aback by very persistent criticism of Europe. And some of it was operational. And this is something that we as Europeans have to agree with. It's and like you said, it's stretched back not just to this administration, but to the previous one as well, perhaps behind closed
doors. And Una, just to interrupt, I think you mean criticism of Europe specifically when it comes to China policy.
That is correct. China policy, but the other part of criticism of Europe was, I want to say, existential. So beyond just China policy. And that is the part that I don't know how to deal with and how to square, because perhaps then this criticism is not rooted in the things we do or don't do, or perhaps do too slowly, but in something else, in a perception of Europe, if you will.
I think this is a perfect place to bring Miguel into the conversation. I think a lot of your interventions throughout the week, Miguel, intersected with the points that Una just raised. So let me also invite you to share your general takeaways from the week, building on the conversation so far.
Thanks, and thanks, Neysun, again, for this amazing week and privilege. I think I came back and most people said, this level of access, I think very few people actually in Europe have the possibility to in a week, in 4 days, actually, to get that level of access. And that's really something there. So thank you. Let me focus it on the lack of strategy, right? I think what I gathered is that despite what the Trump administration or people related to it say, I think there's a sense of that China is somehow very strong. It's a very strong, competitor. We learned that while previously in the Trump administration, there was this phase 1 and phase 2 negotiations with China, where phase 1 was much more transactional, reducing the deficit, China buying American stuff. And phase 2 would be, okay, let's tackle the state capitalism of China that is very problematic, and we have to really kind of try to change it. That's gone, right? They, I think, admitted that phase 2 is gone. There's no desire. I think there's a recognition that it will not be possible to change China. And so my feeling is that because of that, the perception is there is no China strategy, because there's a feeling, okay, we have to compete with China. And how do we compete with China? And I think that's just a very domestic, introspective way of looking at it. MAGA, right? Make America Great Again. And that starts with the Western Hemisphere, right? So here comes the Monroe doctrine that came true as well. Mm-hmm. So let's get strong in the Western Hemisphere. That starts obviously with, okay, getting rid of the liberal, multilateral, free trade, free competition framework, and rather going into more a nationalistic take of things on, national economics, and supporting as the national security strategy emphasizes patriotic forces, including in Europe, right? Because that is what could make us stronger vis-a-vis China. So we have to go, over the weakness of wokeism and get really strong, right? And that has this element into it. And so that means that, the United States needs to have control or oversight from Greenland to Tierra del Fuego, the southern bit of the Americas, in order to compete with China, in order to have sufficient scale, because there's an understanding that China has a lot of scale now. It's a very, very, very impressive competitor, and the United States needs to really kind of get stronger, and that under the Teddy Roosevelt, right, Monroe Doctrine and Monroe Doctrine is get strong at the Western Hemisphere in order to be able to compete, right? But, and then the other element that I saw throughout is that somehow there is a sense that you can build a world without China, right? So this idea that tariffs have worked so far, that this is going well, that not only have other partners reduce the tariffs vis-a-vis American products, but the non-tariff barriers have been lowered too, which has been a long-standing grievance and complaint from the United States. So in many ways, it's like the hammer is working. The hammer is just working. And then eventually, the United States might be even willing to go back to a multilateral setting. There was even talk of a possible new free trade, or a world trade organization without China, right? So, I think in understanding that somehow, because we cannot change China, we still have to isolate China. We need to build this strength from the Western Hemisphere. We need to get all our allies to spend more, to have more deterrence vis-a-vis China. The Koreans have to deal with North Korea. The Japanese have to deal with theirs. The Europeans have to deal with Russia, etc., so that we have the strength in order to compete with China and deter China and isolate China. And I think from a European perspective, all of this is just overwhelming, right? It's a sense of, wow, I mean, none of this makes much sense, right? Are we not really going to be trying to change China? Are we going to leave Greenland to the Americans? Are we going to really create a trade framework without China, the biggest industrial might right now? And so I think from a European perspective, all of this was really, really shocking. I just published a piece trying to summarize a bit my takeaways. And I think from a European, at least from my perspective, was like, wow, Washington has lost it a bit, because it still imagines a world where, people will align and unite against China. And I don't know whether this will work, because my feeling is that the world is a bit more complex than that.
Well, let me ask you to elaborate on that a little bit more, Miguel. So I get your point that to be on this trip and encountering some of the perspectives in DC was shocking, and taking that back to the European context and sharing it with European colleagues really provokes a lot of concern. What is, in your view, how Europe will react to this new set of facts? And, especially when it comes to thinking about China policy, but maybe even more generally, how does Europe process what is now being presented out of Washington?
I think it will, be a source of both division and unity. I mean, Una talked about contradictions. I know I just gave you a very strong contradiction. United and divided. So I think certain countries, they will say, "Wow, this is very, very daunting, but we cannot, let's say, embrace China. We cannot separate from the United States. Hopefully, this nightmare, disappears in a few years."
And Miguel, if I can interrupt for 1 second, just on your point about China, we are at this moment in the news cycle, there's a bunch of Chinese espionage cases throughout Europe that are suddenly getting attention. So it's not as if the challenge from China is not robust at the same time as whatever is being presented out of Washington.
Sure. Again, that the Chinese are spying, not big news from my angle, right? That's most big powers do spy. I don't know whether people are aware of that. But in any case, yes, the challenges with China remain. And so I think it's difficult. And I think, we were divided already in the Biden administration in regards to China. But others would say, we aligned in many things. Tim was just saying the anti-coercion mechanism, the tariffs on EVs. There have been certain issues, the de-risking framework, where, the economic security framework, where, but, I think we have divisions because certain countries, they are now feeling the competition from China in technology, especially industry and technology. Others, not so much, and they want cheap Chinese technology, and they will incorporate it. So I think it's gonna be challenging, and it will create divisions. It has divisions are already there. Already there. But I believe, and Greenland, I think, is a good example. I think at some point, as Tim said as well, there are moments, where there are red lines where you touch some nerves, where the Europeans might say, well, we cannot tolerate this. This is just going too far, right? Does this mean, and I think we said this the week, are you going to go with China? It's not about that. It's not that, that we might see that the United States is not reliable anymore. And I think many leaders have said this. Right now, the United States is not a reliable partner anymore. Some would even say, as Carney, that China might be more reliable than the United States at this moment. But it is not about, if I separate from the United States, I'm going to get closer to China. It's more like, okay, right now I see that the United States is not the partner it was. What shall I do? And that, again, brings divisions, because some might want something, others. But in many ways, the whole idea of saying, okay, what shall we do, in principle, is a force of unity.
Very, very interesting. Very thoughtful, Miguel. Finally, let's bring in from the UK, Sam. And again, Sam, building on what everyone has said and your own takeaways, but I am mindful that, how to put this right, some of the complexities that Washington is presenting towards Europe right now have some resonance with complexities that your country has posed towards Europe since the Brexit in 2016. So maybe at least, we can commiserate over some of these dynamics. Should we come back to you a little bit later? Okay, good. So we will come back to Sam. And we don't have a ton of time left. I know that if we have this great audience, if people want to raise questions, I will work them into the remaining time. But at least to the extent that we still have a little bit of time together, I think, and a question that could be useful to explore among everyone, and maybe just give everyone just a minute or two to answer it, is there in this much more complex landscape any particular issue that you think is posed by China that there could be some degree of coordination between the US and any particular grouping of European countries or Europe as a whole? So that's one question. The second is there any particular issue posed by China that you think would be very hard for there to be coordination, given the differences of opinion? So let me ask each of you kind of round robin style to address both of those, and I'll kind of go in the same order as before. So I'll start with Nadine.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we also heard already from all the participants in this discussion is that coordination clearly is very difficult. On a general note, I think there are substantial differences, as Una mentioned. I mean, and also what I try to make very clear, it's very much on the essence of the relationship that is at question here, and there's always a but. And I think we've also seen this the last couple of days, that when there are very specific issues and very technical issues, like the question of critical raw materials, and cooperating and coordinating the relationship around this issue, like it happened at the Summit on Critical Minerals that just took place in DC, you can see that there is still some room for coordination, but this also includes a very clear US interest. And as it happens to be, this is also of interest for the European Union. So I think this is one area where it would make sense to have collective action, not only among or between the EU and the US, but also including other actors. Japan is one that is mentioned, but also others. And I think in general, when there are very technical questions where it makes sense to somehow create a collective alliance in a very specific matter, export controls and discussions on export control would be another one. It could be of interest to coordinate between the EU and the US. So I think there is still some hope in this sense, and I think there will be exchange also not only on the EU level but also between the member states, EU member states, and Washington quite frequently on these issues. But from a very general point of view, the commitment for engagement is just decreasing, and that is again kind of worrying. Also on a very general note. And maybe I just wanted to add something that you asked, because you asked on what Europe can actually do, and how can we react to all of this shocking developments in DC. And I think what is maybe one aspect that from a European side needs to be learned is that we have several levels, of governance that can reach out to DC. So we not only have Brussels and the EU institutions, but also every member state, and then obviously also through NATO. And I think if that is coordinated, and this is not necessarily a unified position, but if that is coordinated, you can navigate. You can even navigate the Trump administration if you have a very clear interest. And with the case of Greenland, you saw that this is where Europe can build up some resilience in coordination. But again, it needs a very clear common interest also on the European side for that to happen.
Great. Let's continue this round robin, and then we'll come back to Sam at the very end to close us out with the perspective from London. So again, the questions now, Tim, is there any particular issue where you think there could be coordination? And is there any particular issue where you think the differences are really quite vast?
All right, yeah, let me pick up what Nadine said, but also contradict a bit what Miguel said. Because you invite several people and you get different opinions. So I think where there is a common interest, it's not just critical raw materials, but this is where it's the most visible at the moment, is wherever there is a clear case for creating markets of scale. Wherever the challenge of China is that it's such a huge market, or that it's such a huge producer of manufactured goods. Now, obviously, it is not per se a problem that a manufactured good comes from China, but wherever there is sort of an agreement that there is a challenge, a deindustrialization challenge that we have to face, there is in principle a case. I'm not so sure this is such a technical issue, to be honest, and I'm not sure sort of whether it's so easy to overcome the hurdles, even in critical raw materials. I mean, you can say there has been some alignment recently. That's promising, that's good. But also, if several sides want to stockpile and they are competing over the same scarcity of critical raw minerals, all of a sudden the coordination runs the risk of failure again. So, I mean, I think it is critical, but I think there is a common a denominator here. Whether then actually it is to work, that's a different question. Where I don't, and that's sort of here I'm a bit in disagreement, I think, with Miguel, is when he said that the world doesn't want to align against China. I think the deindustrialization challenge is one that is shared across the Atlantic, and I think also beyond. So there, I think it is potential. The question to me is more, to what extent does the Trump administration think it wants to or it needs to align with others? That to me is sort of the bigger question. And there, I think it depends. And there we are back to sort of how coherent is the China strategy that we're seeing in Washington. I think it's more transactional, opportunistic, possibilistic, where the US thinks it can go without others. It does. Where it thinks it needs them, it tries to sign people on or coerce others to sign on to its strategy. So that to me is, I think, something that we've been observing recently, that the US is treating us increasingly like China has. Actually, one of the other colleagues who has been on the trip and listening to us WhatsApped me while we were talking. It's true. I think the US and China with this treatment is sort of marginalizing the EU, and so Europeans need to buckle up and have to sort of take a stance there. I do agree, though, with Nadine. I think that there are also a number of technical issues, like technical standard setting, where there is still a lot of room to compromise and to cooperate and to collaborate. I don't think that's going to be the icebreaker on the political layer. I think this is sort of a completely sort of different level of interaction and cooperation. So I don't really see sort of spillovers from one to the other. And let me maybe close with one observation here that I think limits ultimately the cooperation with this Trump administration and the EU on the other side. To me, it feels that Europe to the US, or not to the US, to the Trump administration in particular, is a bit what Taiwan is to the Chinese Communist Party. We are, in a way, an element in the domestic political discussion. Taiwan, in a way, is proof that democracy is possible within the Chinese culture and on Chinese soil. Europe, at least if it's a prosperous one and a successful one, seems to prove that the vision that within the US political spectrum, mostly the Democratic Party and its supporters promote. So I'm not saying we are part of the domestic game as such, but unlike others, I think there's always a domestic lens through which an ideological domestic lens through which the Trump administration looks at us. And I think that's something that we understand. And I think here Una pointed out something very important distinction that I didn't make before. Yes, the Biden administration had some issues with us, procedural ones. The ones that we're facing now are also procedural, but they go far beyond. And to me, this is this ideological moment. And there, I simply don't see how there would be compromise with Europeans. And we should not, and from a European standpoint, I don't even sort of see how I should want to make that compromise, because that would mean giving up to determine the future of Europe as a liberal, democratic, open society. And that obviously is a red line that I can't cross for cooperating with whoever sits in the White House.
And of course, Tim, much of that ideological perspective was reflected in the new national security strategy of the U.S.,
Absolutely.
which came up a lot throughout the week. And at least we have mentioned now towards the end of the webinar. And again, Una and Miguel, relatively quickly, if you can, so we give Sam a chance to say something. Just again, is there any particular issue that you think still there's prospects for transatlantic coordination? Is there any particular issue that you think the differences are quite vast?
I'm just going to go with the first one because we all know the differences. So if we've run into a wall on the EU side, then I think on the NATO side, the NATO channels day to day are still operational. There's a lot of institutional memory there. In the summer, we were facing kind of we were all at the edge of our seat, whether or not the new SACEUR is going to continue to be American, and we have that, and that's sort of a signal. So from what I hear is that in this and I know it's a controversial theme because many people say when the relationship sours like that, hard security cooperation is the first to go, and the whole Greenland story doesn't help. But I would say that in the hybrid domain, we still see coordination, exchange of information when it comes to cyber stuff, when it comes to FIMI, foreign information manipulation and interference. Under the threshold, it's not necessarily publicized, right? So there's not necessarily as much public naming and shaming going on the US side, but apparently there is a still some kind of a flow and exchange and support day to day there. Whether or not it's going to last, open question.
Miguel, and then we'll close out with Sam.
Critical raw materials could be one, although who is going to do the processing, which is very polluting. And so I have still questions about that. Then global imbalances, China's impressive surplus. But again, I think most of the world wants to have a multilateral arrangement with China on this, and the United States doesn't. And I think the biggest clash coming, which is related to the ideological trend, but not only, let's stick only on the economic side, is the digital sphere, right? BSA, DMA, on that front, I mean, I think the Trump administration would put a lot of pressure on changing EU regulation on this, and we will have big clashes on that front.
Great. Okay, so we come back to Sam. And so, Sam, you're going to close us out with two different missions. One, you're going to share your broad takeaways, but then also answer that last question of whether there's any particular issue that you can see coordination or the reverse. And I hope that one way or another, you bring in your particular expertise of climate into how you respond to that question.
Thanks very much, Neysun. That's quite a heavy burden, but yeah, thanks for sticking with me. So yeah, first on the sort of nature of the new policy, to the extent there is such a thing as a China policy in the United States. I suppose I came away with a sense that while the narrative in the Beltway might be that there isn't one, that may be more of a reflection of the dismay at the breakup of the bipartisan consensus. Whereas I think there is actually a strategy emerging, a policy emerging, albeit one that is more centered on the president himself, as a result operating on shorter timeframes and a more reactive basis. But it has pretty clear hallmarks, which is to say it's really focused on trade, to a certain extent also on technology in a very securitized manner, seeing technology as a sort of component of national security. And in that regard, it's not unlike China, actually, in the way that I think technology is now conceived deeply as part of national security. And I think it's clear that that's underlying that is a changing industrial material reality and an understanding in Washington the degree of China's leadership in key fields, whether that's clean tech, which concerns me a lot, green steel, batteries, solar, or electric vehicles, or automation. There's clearly an anxiety over this advantage viewed strictly through a trade lens, and an overriding concern around a need to rebuild a foothold in value chains that are very dominated by China, like critical minerals, as discussed. I think there are in there perspectives and places where, of course, Europe and the United States share concerns. The issue is, I would say, that the approach that is emerging in Washington is one that has really displaced any other frame through which to view the China relationship. The previous modes of engagement with China in the United States, I think, had multiple tracks. They would look at climate change, they would look at biodiversity loss, they would look at the risks associated with BRI investment, whether it's debt or social environmental risks. They would be thinking about human rights concerns in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in Tibet. To my, at least my strong impression is that these have largely been displaced in favor of a very singular, very unilateral kind of approach to China. And that is, whether we like it or not, sort of what characterizes now US-China policy. And I think that really places a very heavy burden on Europe to see whether there is any way to coordinate with the United States, because it's so fundamentally different. In Europe, there's this sort of triptych approach, so-called, to dealing with China, viewing it as simultaneously a partner, a competitor, and a rival. In the UK, we have something similar: cooperate, challenge, and compete. That's not everything. It needs further complexifying. I have my critiques of that approach, but I think generally that actually is quite a major divergence in the transatlantic alliance in terms of the way we approach China, and it makes really thinking about how we actually coordinate around those themes, which the esteemed sort of panelists raised, which I agree are ones around which we could maybe coordinate. It makes it very difficult, and it means that Europe is going to really have to act with, in my opinion, sort of much greater unity and cohesion and clarity to think about actually where do we stand in regard to all of these issues where China plays a profound role, whether it's the transformation of industrial systems, whether it's climate change, whether it's AI, automation. Sort of China runs through all of these challenges to our society and our industries, throughout, and yet the kind of singular unilateral trade focused approach of the United States is so far from the way that I could begin to challenge it that I don't even quite know where to start.
Sam, I'll just ask you a follow-up as we close here. This is maybe not a fair question to you, not being within our policy discussion within the US, but I'm going to pose it anyway. Many actors in our policy debates in the US with respect to China who are understood to have a more hawkish perspective seem to be indicating that they are unhappy with some of the new, more complicated signaling that's coming out of this administration, including with the prospects of the bilateral visits between the two leaders over the next year. Did you get the sense that that sentiment, or at least that the shift that may be happening in the US when it comes to China could open up space for more robustly exploring these other types of dimensions of the relationship with China that you were just listing? Because that seems to be something that in our policy debate, some people think could happen, that this shift a little bit away from what we sometimes refer to as the bipartisan consensus that views China really through a very exclusive threat matrix. If we're shifting away from that, then maybe, in fact, we can meet Europe intellectually in exploring the relation with China as having all these multifaceted dimensions.
I think that's what's strange and complicated about this particular. I can see why hawks would be concerned about the shift away from the bipartisan consensus, and I can see why this in some ways might be interpreted therefore as a more kind of dovish moment because of the transactional focus basically of the president and the extent to which China clearly showed its leverage and its cards, to go back to this theme in sort of recent months, and the extent to which that seems to have shifted the way that the US views China. And yet I saw remarkably little interest in thinking about a multidimensional approach. From my perspective, for example, looking at climate, the reason I think the United States should be working on climate with China is not because I think the US can shape China's energy policy in a meaningful way. It's because I think it's important to maintain, multiple tracks of conversation, because it's useful for us to better understand each other, and because it also can provide off-ramps for de-escalation when other areas are very hot. I don't think that the current US administration has any interest in that type of multifaceted approach, or in what they see as long-winded processes. It's really about shorter term wins, and those are conceived in kind of geoeconomic terms.
That's very thoughtful, Sam. I thought I was going to give you the last word, but in fact, I'm going to give Tim the last word in today's discussion.
Yeah, I wanted to add no disagreement with what Sam said, but one thing that struck me, and we haven't touched upon it, is I think the US feels, or the Trump administration feels, it is winning, but so does China at the moment as well. And I wonder, as a European who will be affected by all this, what happens if one of the two sides ultimately realizes that this is going the other way, because both seem to have a rather zero-sum understanding of winning. So not both, so in a different mindset, both sides could be winning, but that's not happening. And to me, the question is really, what new dynamic will this take? And frankly speaking, from my viewpoint, I find the Beijing's winning story more convincing than Washington's at the moment. So my question is, and that I want to close with, is sort of what happens in Washington once the Trump administration realizes it may not be winning?
That's a very good question. And I have to say, my wish was that we had more time to address it. We have reached the end of today's program. My only regret about today's discussion is that we only had an hour and a little bit over to discuss. We easily could have gone much, much longer. I never even really got to pose the question that I was thinking about throughout the week of whether there could be something out of the current moment in transatlantic relations which could spur greater coordination just within Europe itself, which was, to me, the biggest takeaway from the week of kind of watching all of you discuss these issues from different vantage points, whether there could be some new momentum towards some greater degree of coordination in Europe generally, but also with respect to China. Sadly, we're going to have to leave that question on the table. I would love to continue this conversation with all of you, as I'm sure we will offline. But again, it was really such a privilege to be with all of you in DC that week in January. And I miss being around all of you. I'm glad that we got to have this follow-on conversation online, and hopefully we will find other ways to continue the discussion in different mediums in the years ahead. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much for everyone who joined the Zoom today, and to those who will be watching on YouTube later. Please keep an eye on further programming from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. We have a lot more webinars and podcasts and all sorts of things coming your way. But for today, this is it. Have a good day, everyone, and we'll see you soon.